We've got some presenters that I'd like to hear from today. We're going to start off with Anna Boustead. Anna's the coordinator of the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network. She's very experienced in environmental and water policy and has done a great deal of thinking about the way in which branding can operate and can assist communities and some of the pitfalls that can be experienced when communities aren't mindful of how branding works. So Anna, if you will.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Thank you. And thanks to Marcus and Michael behind the scenes here, keeping everything ticking over so well. And yeah, just wanted to say it's a privilege to be introduced by Robert Dalton, who's done a lot of work in the Indigenous policy space and been working very hard over the years to improve Aboriginal empowerment. I'll be talking just a little bit before handing over to our other speakers who are all actively engaged in the carbon industry and will be able to give other insights. So I just want to start by saying this is my perspective as a coordinator of the Indigenous Carbon Industry Network, and shouldn't be in any way construed as any sort of legal or financial advice, just as a disclaimer. Can't seem to control the slides. Thank you. So why share your story in the first place? Well, it builds a collective understanding of what is Savanna fire management. It's an empowering process that builds confidence and self-esteem. And being able to present in front of people in particular does take a lot of practice. And I can assure everyone that it's taken me a lot of practice to be able to present in front of people like I am today. So keep in mind that when you see people getting up and speaking, everyone does feel nervous and everyone does have those feelings of wondering whether, they're going to say the right thing. But I really encourage everyone to get up, stand up and have your say and share your story. Also, this is in-demand expertise that Aboriginal people have in Savanna fire management, and it's inspiring. It's unique, it's real, and it's interesting. And for those reasons, it's in very high demand, not only in Australia, but around the world. Everyone's very interested to hear about the work that you do because it is very interesting and very different to what many people see in other parts of the world. And the economic value so the other important thing to remember is that there's an economic value attached to your story and to your brand, which I guess is through evidence of what people refer to as the co-benefits of the carbon credits delivered through your Savanna fire management. And those co-benefits include things like better outcomes for your communities, as well as better outcomes for the environment and for animals and plants, and also for cultural sites. So just to give some indication of the economic value of Indigenous carbon credits, the CommBank publishes a ACCU price, carbon credit unit price, which is around $16.57, the spot price on the carbon market. And then on the Indigenous carbon market, Indigenous carbon credits fetch a much higher price, anywhere from $17 to around $25 in recognition of those multiple co-benefits that are delivered as part of your projects. And the industry is valued at around $20 million each year across the north. One thing to consider is, why do buyers seek Indigenous carbon credit? And I'm sure some of our other speakers will be able to talk to this topic today. But first of all, they want to be able to generally offset their greenhouse gas emissions. So they create pollution through their commercial activities, through their business, and they want to be able to offset their pollution by buying carbon credit units. If their shareholders and customers want their company to be ethical, and there's a strong desire for supporting Indigenous Australian-owned projects. So part of it is also the company wanting to keep shareholders happy, as well as seeking to gain what's often referred to as market share, which is basically getting more customers through the door, because customers do want to see companies supporting projects like the projects that you contribute to. Also, the social license, another thing to consider is the social license to operate gained by that company by associating their brand with your brand. So by associating their company logo with your Ranger logo or photos or videos, when people see that, they think, oh, this must be a good company, they're doing good things. So that's part of their social license to operate, because generally in the community, they're seen to be a good company. And that's, goes to the reputation of the company. And the other thing is to differentiate their brand and product. And the Qantas representative refers to this in the video on our website when he talks about how their customers want to buy Indigenous Savanna burning carbon credits, and so they offer that as an option when customers offset their flights. There's a few points for buyers that could assist the Indigenous carbon industry. Being upfront and transparent about that, what they seek to gain, is really important, because that way everyone is aware of what both parties are getting out of that relationship, and where the benefit will come in. The other thing is, it's important for buyers to ask first before using photos and videos and images of the group's hard work. And it's important that they negotiate to put in place protocols for the sharing of images and videos. Also, it's very important for the companies seek to build trust, and ethical and responsible behaviour leads to good long-term business relationships. Whereas on the other hand, one bad experience can be very damaging. So it's important that buyers seek to embrace good ethical and responsible behaviour. And buyers do have a number of standards in the industry that they can seek to use, particularly the Carbon Market Institute's Code of Conduct. And I think in the next session, a number of carbon companies will be talking about how they operate in the carbon industry and referring to that Code of Conduct. Also, the ICIN has published guidelines to seeking the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous communities in relation to carbon projects, Savanna carbon projects. So that's a good reference, as is the Our Knowledge, Our Way guidelines published by CSIRO. For sellers, so for Indigenous organisations that are selling carbon credits, it's important to seek legal and financial advice to ensure that you have well-informed and clear agreements in place with buyers. And also, you can leverage business relationships to gain more benefits for your community. And there are lots of examples of that happening. I'm sure we'll hear some of them later on today. And finally, it's important to stay in control and protect your brand by putting marketing and legal strategies in place to own your story. So there's lots of ways you can own your story through marketing. First of all, your story is unique to you. It's your story and yours only. You can put things in place to prevent people from using your story without permission. But I think for Indigenous owned carbon projects, talking in your own language is a really great way to demonstrate that this is your story, and clearly demonstrates no one else would be able to copy that. So that's a great way to demonstrate that. And we've seen that with the Tamara Rangers in their video yesterday. Also, use of branding like ranger badges and logos can be used, and important to seek advice and put in place media protocols and identify and train spokespeople. And the other thing to remember is that once something is published online, it's generally available to everyone and can be difficult to withdraw. And that's particularly important to remember with social media. If you put something up on Facebook, then Facebook actually owns that. So it can be very difficult to withdraw after that. And finally, it's important to make a communications plan and think about what it is you want to say, who do you want to talk to, and what do you want to say, and think about what tools are available to help you to do that. And there's some of the platforms that we have to help you share your story, and you're welcome to send anything through to us through our various networks, and we'll share that at any time. Thank you. I'll just hand back over to Robyn, who I think will bring on the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Anna, that was a really good session. Lots of really good insights in there. I suppose what really stood out to me in terms of some of the things you were saying is that the relationship between buyer and seller really is a partnership more than it's anything else. That it's important for groups to understand their partners and what they're about and what they want. And it's important for groups to identify in their head who might be the right partner versus the wrong partner. The fact that a buyer might be arriving with large sums of money doesn't necessarily make them the best fit, because if your brand takes damage from partnering with the wrong person, that can last for a long, long time and be very difficult to try and turn around. I think it's also important to understand that just because the relationship between buyers and sellers is a partnership doesn't mean that the power balance is equal there. So, you know, many groups are sort of coming up against big corporates with limitless pockets and lawyers and policy advisors and all sorts of things. And it's very difficult to compete equally, which is why it's important to have a plan. It's important for groups to understand what they want out of the relationship and to think about more than just the money exchanged. To bring on our next speaker, I'd like to briefly introduce Paul Lane, or Laney as I know him, of the Wilinggin Aboriginal Corporation. He's also the director of the Lingari Foundation, based in the Kimberleys. He's done lots of work with community and social development, and is at the forefront of thinking around the modern Aboriginal carbon industry. Welcome, Laney, if you're there.
Yeah, morning, Rob. Thanks very much for that. And Anna, nice to see you again. As Robbie pointed out, my sort of background has been working towards the achievements of rights and interests for Aboriginal people, you know, in the last 20 odd years through native title and things like that. And I came across to work here for the Narrandin people at their organisation, Wilinggin, about nearly 4 years ago. And for me, it was a different part of the business that people had to do. But one of the things that was really driven home for me is that the worth that Aboriginal people have and in the achievement of obtaining their rights not only brings additional responsibilities and needs like that, but that for the first time ever, people are really understanding where their values and the worth of their culture, their land and their assets and their culture and the things that they do have a substantial value within the broader Australian economy. And carbon just happens to be one of those aspects of it. And I won't say it came as a surprise to a lot of the Narrandin people that what they had and which they valued for thousands of years has this value, because for them it's just a given, it has this value. But I think we have tended to underestimate the actual worth outside of the Aboriginal society of what we are responsible for. And one of the outcomes from this entry into the carbon economy is this has really been driven home for people. And often our people will say to us, this is very good and we're bringing some money in here and it's all very useful to do that sort of thing. But it's a bit like Anna was talking about, you go into doing a deal simply because it's a commercial benefit and outcome for you. And it was a bit like non-swimmers going out into the water and getting a bit deep, and then you go too far out and then you realise, gee, I've given away a whole lot more here than what I intended to give. So the ability for Aboriginal people to determine internally the worth of what they have and what are their values and what's important to be preserved and maintained, and what are the compromises that will have to be made if you're going to play in this commercial field, need to be really well understood by the Aboriginal organisations before they enter into the deep water, as it were. So one of the things for us, we have a large area of responsibility in terms of our land, but we're a relatively small group, and we don't have a great deal of other external resources to sustain all the things that people want to do, both to sustain their land and their country and their culture. So we have to be quite strategic about how we trade, as it were, in the economy, and we have to strategically look at those people who can enhance what we're trying to do, but also add value to what we're trying to do, but without us giving away, the kitchen sink, as it were. So our key partners in all we do are either focused on support around land management through organisations like AWC and WWF and others like that. And on the other hand, we have these commercial partnerships with people who want to buy carbon credits off us or want access to our country for cultural tourism or things like that. So the balance and interest of those groups doesn't always necessarily line up and places us in the middle of that discussion. But the lessons that we've been having to learn here, that we bring to the table far more value than what we really had previously recognised. And so the task for us has been to ensure that we use the leverage and natural resources that we have at our table to extract not only the best deal, but the best long-term sustainable way of looking after our country. And Robbie talked about brands, and brands are important, but for the Narrandin people, they're not a brand. They're a people with a language and a culture and things. So understanding that what at the commercial end looks like brand, for us is the Narrandin people and their way of life. So you need to be careful about just getting caught up in this language of the commercial operation or the land management operation or the conservation management language. The Narrandin people have a language and a culture that has a worth and value unique to those people, and that in itself has an enormous asset for which to use as leverage when you're dealing with commercial and for conservation partners. So getting balance in those partnerships is critical. That the Narrandin understand what they bring to the table, and they understand the worth of what they bring to the table, and they try not to sell it short. They look to getting the deal done, but not necessarily compromising everything in the process. And it's a bit like Anna was saying, once these things are out there and you've made the compromise, coming back is very difficult to do. So understanding that as you go into these arrangements, that you do with a very firm position about who you are and what you are and what you want out of it. The story does matter, but the story is only one aspect of it. For the Narrandin, again, it's not a story, it's a people with a language. The commercial operators, the people who buy the carbon credits and others, they want to use the story. So we have to be very careful about how, or what elements of that story we're prepared to put forward and how they're interpreted. So again, it goes back to those two things that both Robbie and Anna have referred to, that know what it is that you're prepared to put onto the table in these, when you're dealing with these companies, and how far you're prepared to extend it, and what's the point of your compromise. So for us, it's been a very interesting learning process, because we've come into commercial fields and to do these sorts of things, but to bring the mob along with the exercises can often be a challenge. But if you set your own expectations about what you're trying to achieve, and have that as your line in the sand about how far you're prepared to take this, you need to understand that at the outset before you start entering into these arrangements. There are good partners out there, and there's some bloody terrible partners out there as well, who will walk away as quickly as they came in the door if it suits their purposes. Aboriginal people are on the country forever. The same is not always going to be for our corporate partners, and it's not going to be the same for our conservation partners. They'll extract what they need out of any partnership, and then they will move on to whatever it is they do next. So it's very important that we maintain the integrity of what we're bringing to the table. Often you'll get the partners or potential partners coming through the door and saying, oh, well, we need to understand this, and we'd like to be able to understand that, and how can we use all of these sorts of things? Well, what tends to happen is we negotiate on the run, and oh yeah, that'll be acceptable, that won't be acceptable. But unless you've got a very firm position at the outset about where you want to be in the context of that partnership and what you want out of it, you run the real risk of just getting into deep water, and you'll be out there too far before you realise how far it's gone. So the partnerships are critical to what we're doing. The collaboration is critical to what we're doing. We don't have all the resources, and we clearly don't have all of the expertise that's necessary to do all the things that we need to do to preserve our country. And we have to look for these partnerships, and we have to look for people that we're going to collaborate with. But the critical piece of it is to hold your worth as a society, and have some lines in the sand that you're not going to go across no matter what the price is. Because at the end of the day, these partners and collaborators and others, they'll wander off and they'll do whatever they do in this world. And that's fine. That's the nature of things. We're not marrying these people. We don't want them to live with us forever. But we want to make sure that whilst ever the relationship is in place, that the relationship has integrity, and that what we bring to the table gets recognised for what it really is, a equal worth, an equal value to anything else that anyone else brings to the table. And I think if the lessons being learned, is interesting to watch some of these presentations in the last couple of days. People are getting this, people understand it, but we need to be vigilant about it, and we need to be extremely careful that we just don't become swayed by the top dollar or the top bucket of resources that people bring to the table. We need to be careful about how we engage with people in the same way as we do in all the other relationships in our lives. And it's heartening to see the changes and the clever way that Aboriginal people are doing this stuff these days. But it's fresh country for a lot of us, and a lot of the Aboriginal people are wary of the risk of stepping too far into this. So important we do it, important we build these relationships, but always understand that they're just that. They're relationships and partnerships that will have a time on them, essentially. It might be a very long time, but that's good. But they are simply that. They're just relationships, and like every relationship, it needs to be equal, and there needs to be a very clear recognition that what Aboriginal people bring to the table has equal weighting for anything that any other partners bring to the table. So thanks for that. Look, thanks for your patience with everybody with the technology over the couple of days. It's been an interesting experience for me, but I'd be happy for questions if people want to put them. And I hope that made some sense to some of you.
Laney, thank you. That was excellent, and some very valid points made there. A couple of things that stood out for me, talking about responsibility, and Laney, you're asserting that responsibility goes both ways, and that's true. But I do think, and it is an ongoing problem, not just for Aboriginal groups who want to partner with sort of bigger corporates, but it's a broader problem that corporate's idea of responsibility isn't the same as the general communities, and it most certainly isn't the same as Aboriginal people's idea about responsibility. The overriding connection to country is just one beginning, whereas the overriding connection to profit is what drives the corporates. I note your point as well, Laney, that people are not a brand, and that got me to thinking that while people are not a brand, this is a very constantly evolving in a very fast-moving space in terms of politics, in terms of the market, in terms of all of those things. And it's a global movement. I think it's really important that we all acknowledge that Aboriginal people live locally. The connection to country is solid. It always has been. It always will be. But that we are part of a global movement. The Paris targets, the current political debate in this country about how to best meet those Paris targets. I note that newspaper reports recently have been exploring the idea that Australia might be carbon neutral by 2050 and what the pathway to that might look like. Now, in some regards, 2050 is a long way away. In many ways, it's the blink of an eye for Aboriginal people. And we've got to acknowledge that policymakers, Aboriginal people and corporates all have to acknowledge Laney's point that Aboriginal people will be living on country forever. And the opportunities that 2050 might bring will come and go very quickly. And so lots more careful planning should be factored in to groups and how they want to work with people.
Robbie, can I just follow on from that? One of the really critical things about this discussion that's going on about 2050, or, you know, with the madness of what goes on with climate discussion in this country, the one constant in all of this that's going on here is that Aboriginal people and their organisations are at the forefront of all the good things that are happening in terms of the dealing with climate change in this country. The Royal Commission into the bushfires recognised many aspects of that. And again, we need to be very careful that we don't rest on our laurels on that, because what tends to happen is, like the Royal Commission and others, they look at that and say, oh, that's a good idea, let's work out how we adapt that. And the next thing on the knocking at our door will be a corporate with have I got a big deal about how we can align ourselves with your, your achievements in land management and climate management. So we in a very, very, very strong position to maximise the commercial return on what we're doing here, which is fine. But we didn't enter into this for the commercial. The commercial is a side piece to this from our perspective. And we need to be very careful that we just don't compromise the high standards that we've set around these things. So to accommodate, because we're going to have people knocking on all our doors in coming months, working out how are we going to badge ourselves to be looking like we're heading to 2050 on the coattails of what Aboriginal people have been doing for 25 years in this country. So again, thanks for that. Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks. I've often made the point that while we might represent 1% of the broader Australian population, we certainly don't do 1% of the land management. I'll ask our next speaker to please make herself available. Clare Price from the Carbon Market Institute. Claire's a very experienced communication and marketing professional who's worked with international and humanitarian organisations. And I imagine I've got a lot to learn from Clare as well. Welcome, Clare.
Hi, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction, Robbie. And it's wonderful to be in a session with Anna and Paul, and I'll just share my presentation with you. Hang on, that's not quite working. Okay. I would like to start by stating that I'm joining you from the land of the Wurundjeri people, and I would like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. And I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to Aboriginal elders joining from other communities today. So I am the communications manager from an organisation called the Carbon Market Institute. We are an independent industry association for business leading the transition to net zero emissions. We have more than 90 corporate members. So my presentation is going to be from a different angle, and it's the communications requests or requirements that come from the corporate side. So our membership is made up of, as I said, 90 organisations, and they range from corporate entities such as Qantas, BHP, BP, Shell, to carbon farming developers such as Alpha, Aboriginal Carbon Foundation, and organisations such as ICIN. I want to start by just setting the scene a bit. So corporate communications requests around carbon farming or Savanna fire projects will only be increasing. The carbon farming sector will be growing. We have stated that it will need to triple in size by 2030 to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Corporate climate commitments are going to increase. Over the last 12 months, we have seen so many corporates committing to net zero by 2050. So this means that in their climate action plans, they'll be reducing emissions and then offsetting the emissions that they can't reduce through things like carbon farming and purchasing carbon credits. And as an aside, I just wanted to state that CMI is now climate active, and we have purchased carbon credits through the Tiwi Islands Savanna Burning Project. Why do corporates want to tell stories about carbon farming? Well, apart from showing that they are actively working towards their climate goals, they also want to be a part of telling this really positive story about carbon farming, as Anna mentioned earlier in a presentation. Carbon farming or Savanna fire projects are so inspirational, they're positive, they're uplifting. People in general love stories about protecting the country, protecting bush, job creation in rural areas, trees, animals, biodiversity. These are stories that people just love to learn about, and corporates, would love to tell them. This picture here on the slide is a carbon farming project in the Mallee region of Victoria. And as you can see, it's just a beautiful, captivating image of lines of planted trees next to a bare, unused wheat farm. And you can just see how visually beautiful and spectacular that is. So corporates want communications content about carbon farming for lots of different platforms. With all of these climate ambitions and climate announcements, there are corporate reports, climate change reports, sustainability reports, guides, pathways, approaches, position statements, action plans. So all of these corporate reports, they would love communications content in those. There's also websites, newsletters, Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. There's media requests, radio, TV, print, and it comes in the form of photography, videography, written stories, audio interviews. So in terms of places where comms content is needed, the list is endless. I wanted to play with you a carbon farming video that I've just been involved in producing, and this is exactly the kind of content, although this isn't a fire management project. It's a different carbon farming methodology, but this is exactly the kind of video content that corporates are looking for, because it is so visually appealing. It's easy to get your head around carbon farming, and it's short and succinct. I'll just play it. It goes for 2 minutes.
You increase your rejuvenation, your grasses grow better, everything happens if you manage the property. The emission reduction fund has allowed you to do that, and because it's the resource is there, it's just a matter of putting it to work for you. You still graze it, but you can control graze it.
Before, in the drought, it was wonderful because you could not worry too much about if you had to buy feed for the sheep. You could afford to do that. You know, you have your business plan, you think, oh, well, we'll do this fence this year and that fence next year, and it accelerated all that.
And it also enabled us to employ people. So the people from town benefit from it as well. I've set an example out here and I'm doing that at present. It answers itself. You don't have to talk, just come and have a look.
I hope you can hear me okay. Sorry about the sound issues. So I just wanted to play that video because I know it's not about Savanna fire burning, but it's an example of a short 2-minute video about carbon farming. But what I want to talk about now is all of the involvement that goes into creating a video like that. And it's from the corporate entity side, but also from the carbon farmer side. And I'm sure a lot of you are aware of this, but producing a video like that does take a lot of time. It can take up to 2 months. It involves pre-production, which is interviewing people that will be in the video over the phone, developing a script, deciding the shot list, arranging travel arrangements, employing creative teams. Filming on the day is often a really long day of work. All talent must be there on the day, available to be interviewed. Post-production is editing, music selection, managing changes, writing captions, and then there's a communication strategy at the end. So basically, this takes a lot of effort and time from the carbon farmer side, and the corporate entity needs the talent to be involved in the process, but it does take a lot of time from the talent, is the point I really want to make. And then I also wanted to play a media story that I was involved in setting up about carbon farming. I'll just play it for a bit. Let me know if there's any sound issues.
Welcome to AM. Good morning, I'm Sabra Lane. Over the past week, we've heard a lot about plans to reduce carbon emissions through boosting technology. One small element of that involves lowering the cost of carbon farming. That's the process of capturing and holding carbon in vegetation and soils through planting and better management of livestock, fertiliser and fire. Annie Guest reports.
Agri-businessman Matthew Warnkin helped establish the world's first soil carbon farm to receive government carbon credits. It's near Warragul in Victoria.
At its essence, it's about changing farm practices to take carbon out of the atmosphere, where it's a problem, and put it into the soil, where it's an actual asset.
It's needed because cropping and grazing depletes about half the soil's carbon, and carbon helps soil.
I can stop that there, but the purpose of playing that again is I wanted to talk about how much time and effort a media piece like that is for the carbon farmer side. So media requests often come in very last minute because they're connected to an outside event or media story that's breaking. And media and journalists react very quickly, and they expect people to be available almost instantly for interviews for radio and television. And it can be very stressful, and it can put a lot of pressure on people working on these projects. So my last slide is very similar to a lot of points and tips that Paul and Anna both provided in their presentations. And it's basically stating again that it's really important from the outset for carbon farmer developers to be thinking about media and communications requirements from the very beginning when they enter into a partnership with a corporate, and to stipulate expectations, limitations, IP, branding and budget. It's communications and media, it takes a lot of time and effort to manage it, and there needs to be funding available so this work stream can be managed by somebody within your organisation. And these are conversations you need to have at the beginning. Developing a media and communications plan was discussed by Anna. And another thing that I recommend is thinking about potential media spokespeople in your organisation. It's really important that if a journalist comes to you that there are people pre-prepared and ready to be involved in media, and that you can state the topics that they can talk to. Developing your own photography and videography library so you can provide content for corporate communications requests, and also a bank of case studies. So it's the same kind of key statements that other speakers were mentioning, that it's really good to think about communications from the beginning and to be really clear on what's possible and what you're able to provide, because these kind of requests will only grow. Thank you.
Claire, thank you. A very informative and insightful session on the way media and communications can be both adapted, but can also represent a bit of a risk, a double-edged sword, one might say. It did strike me, thinking about some of your comments there, Claire, that one of the overriding concerns, and Laney has touched on this in his session, is that dealing with the media is tricky. Communications plans are tricky. Often you need professional help, so it's important to be thinking about that from the outset when you're looking at the partnerships that you want to form. And I suppose in thinking about that, it's vital that groups consider what cultural integrity means to them, and that's woven through whatever their digital or their online or their technological presence looks like. And that's why the planning for a media position and how you're going to approach how you deal with media and communications needs to be done at the beginning of partnership making, and it needs to be done in a culturally adaptive and sensitive way. If I might, I now turn to our final presenter for the day in Robyn Bartlett. Robyn's the CEO of Old Mapoon Aboriginal Corporation. She has a legal background and has worked across a range of mining, native title and cultural heritage areas. Welcome, Robyn, if you're available.
Hi.
Take it away.
Great, thanks, Robbie. Thank you everyone for having me. I am joining you today from Gimoi, Wallabarri, Dingy country here in Cairns, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'll just share, I have a short presentation to share with you. So what I'm talking about today is building your brand in an online world, and specifically looking at social media. So who we are, Old Mapoon Aboriginal Corporation, we are a land trust holding Aboriginal freehold over just over 174,000 hectares on the Western Cape York around the Mapoon region. We operate obviously an Indigenous carbon project over most of our land, and as an organisation we envisage a thriving Mapoon and undertake projects for the benefit and growth of the Mapoon community. In May of last year, we decided to get on social media platforms. I was quite reluctant to do it. And as I imagine most groups have, most people on social media have experienced or seen some negativity around socials. But fortunately, that hasn't been our experience at all. I chose to outsource our social media management and engage an organisation called Paragon Collective. I knew that telling a story with our social media would build the OMAC brand, and I also knew it needed to be reliable, consistent approach, and that I couldn't dedicate that time to it. I wanted to build a brand. Scratch that, I needed to build a brand. OMAC's sources of income are limited, our carbon project is small, and the resultant ACCUs are small. Our projects and our ability to impact the Mapoon community and our ability to care for country rely on external funding. For OMAC, building our brand and owning that brand story was worth investing in professional support. Today, it brings value at every turn. So owning your story. The simplest thing about owning your story is for each organisation, whether you're a ranger group, whether you're a land management organisation, you live and breathe that story every day. And that story is more than just your carbon project story. Every organisation is doing so much more for their country, their community and their people. And what are the greatest things that some of the things to think about are what are the great things you do with the income from your ACCU sales? What are the other things that your organisation does that have little or nothing even to do with your carbon project? So, you know, do you have a junior ranger program? Do you have a women's ranger program? Own that story. And I think coming off the back of a lot of the things that, that Paul mentioned is that if you don't own that story and use it for the betterment of your organisation, and today we're calling that branding, but that branding really is the betterment of your organisation. If you don't own that story, someone else will. Every time a buyer of your ACCUs tells the story about the work that your organisation does, they take something from you, unless you have created that story yourself. They take your work and get to spin a story that suits their needs. By using social media to tell your story, puts it out there and takes your whole audience on the journey with you. So you decide that journey. You decide the messages and the stories that are important and relevant to share. So here's a little bit of an example of our social media reach in the last 9 months that my social media manager has provided me. So you can see in that short period of time, the lifetime reach of our account is 181,000 people. Now, earlier this year, we had a post go viral that reached just over 120,000 people and was shared just shy of 1,000 times. That's the power of social media, and that's the power of sharing your story. So what does it all mean? Owning your brand story is owning the things that you do, and you get to tell the world about the great work that you're doing. You can integrate your fire story into the story of the whole of your organisation and what it's doing. When we turn back to the sale of carbon credits, you can target buyers who can benefit from your story, and you can benefit from that partnership as well. Additionally, another benefit to social media is using it as a communication tool with countrymen and women about what you're doing. So if you go back through OMAC social media, you'll find posts advertising when we're going to be doing our burning, when the aerial burning's happening, advertising when our aerial culling programs were starting and where they were going to be. It is a phenomenal tool for engaging with your chosen audience. And this is a bit about us. You know, we're social. You can find us on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, through our website, through all of these things. And, you know, I'll just stop the screen share for a moment. The important thing about social media is that, you know, while Claire mentioned all of that amazing photography and videography work that you want to do, you can get there. And with social media, you get to start by sharing other people's images. So, you know, you could be a small organisation like we are. You may not have a media officer. You may not have a skilled photographer within your organisation or a videographer, because not many people do. But you can start somewhere and generate interest. So off the back of not only that viral post, we had a post 3 days later where a call came in from ABC Radio for me, who wanted to undertake an interview based on, you know, rubbish along our beaches in Mapoon. So that little bit of social sway just brings your organisation and what you're doing into the spotlight. And that might be about carbon, that might be about something entirely different. But having the ability to tell your story is so powerful. And I know that my board, who were also very reluctant to get our organisation into social media, has been really excited and empowered by what we can share and what we can do with our socials, because we just reach so many people. You know, for 9 months of social media, we've reached on average 20,000 people each month across both Instagram and Facebook. So that's phenomenal. And we, as I said, we're a small organisation, so the choice to outsource that social media management has made it possible for us to really start driving an impact and driving our own story and our own brand and the projects that we're undertaking in an online platform. If anyone has any questions about social media and the trappings and the pitfalls of social media.
Thanks, Robyn. That was another excellent presentation. And I love the idea that you and your board and your organisation have such a strong grasp on social media and its pitfalls, because Lord knows most of the users of social media don't understand the pitfalls themselves. A couple of messages that I took away from that that were of particular interest to me is the idea that a story is either in or it's out, and you've only got limited control of it when it's out. And so that comes back to I may sound like I'm harping on a little bit here. That comes back to the idea that you have to be planning this stuff from the beginning, not make it up as you go along, because that's when the risk creeps in that you will lose control of things. And that's when organisations, particularly Aboriginal organisations who may or may not have much experience, can take damage, as in reputational damage. Another idea I just wanted to explore really quickly is the idea that you might need to make a decision when you're putting something up on social media about whether something is a corporate story or whether it's a cultural story, because there is overlay in the land management space. And I just thought that it's interesting to decide if there's a distinction in the type of story you're telling early. And that lends itself to, if it's a cultural story, you're going to need permissions. You're going to need permissions from the right people to tell that cultural story, of course. Traditional owners, landowners, people with connections, the list goes on. If it's a corporate story, equally, you're going to need very different permissions, as in who has the ability to sign off on your messaging, who has ultimate responsibility for that. And that comes back to some of the earlier debate about, is there a person in your organisation who is a go-to, and do they have the capacity to handle if things do start getting a bit tricky? So thanks for that, Robyn. That was really good. We're coming towards the end of the session, and I just wanted to ask each of our panelists a quick question, and I might start with you, Lainey, if you're still on deck. This looks like a water bottle, but it's actually a genie in a lamp. So just stay with me here. I'm going somewhere with this. If you were able to release this genie and it could grant you one wish for your organisation in the branding, comms and media space, what would you ask that genie, Lainey?
I've seen
Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. Look, one of the most difficult things for us in the context of our partnership activity was getting people who deal with the media all the time, who are continually putting out stories and photos and whatever is like that, to actually understand that for Aboriginal people, operating in that mainstream media model isn't always the most comfortable. And if you were extracting anything out of that genie now, would be the ability for people who want to partner with Aboriginal organisations to recognise that Aboriginal people have a very different worldview on a whole range of fronts, and what might be appropriate and interesting for Guttiers isn't necessarily the same for the Narrandin and others. So that's what I'd like out of a bottle, an instant explanation for our potential partners to understand that they're dealing with a society of people who don't necessarily operate in the same mode as they do in terms of communications and telling stories.
Excellent. Claire, if you're there.
I'm here. I would say I would like time to come out of the bottle, because communications and media, it's always an afterthought. People are very busy in their jobs, doing things that are incredibly important. But as we've discussed, and everybody's presentations have alluded to, what communications and media needs is people actually sitting down in the same room at the beginning of a partnership and prioritising and discussing communications and media. So I would put that as my answer, that there was enough time on everybody's schedules to actually focus on this, as it's so important.
Very good. Thanks, Claire. Robyn, if you will.
For us, funding, but for the industry, off the back of sort of exactly what Claire said, the understanding to make it a priority, because that, and it's one of the things that we're trying to engage right now, is to have our own media officer who is dedicated to photography and videography, because we are doing great projects in the community. And at the times when the Mapoon community has made some videos about things happening in the community, they've gone gangbusters on the likes of YouTube and everything else. So the funding for me to make a permanent full-time media officer role to capture the projects, to capture the beauty of country and to be able to share those things goes so far with building our brand. And I think that it's important for organisations to see it as a priority, because even if it's not for building your brand, the ability to capture that stuff for posterity. And, you know, we're doing a healthy country planning process at the moment, and it's been so vital to capture photos of who's involved and video of who's in the consultation, not to publish, but to go, hey, these people were there when we made these big decisions about how we were going to manage country.
Excellent. Thank you. Anna?
Thanks, Robbie.
One wish.
Thank you. I guess it would be for groups to understand the immense value of your own story and of the work that you do and the level of interest from people all around Australia and all around the world who really want to support the work that you're doing. But I guess from your side, it's important to work out beforehand what you want out of that relationship, and to do that early and come into the relationship prepared, so that it at the end of the day benefits your group, and that story doesn't just get taken away and used in a way that you're not happy with. So I think that there's been a lot of really interesting presentations today, and they've really highlighted just the need to own your story and think about how you go about setting boundaries with some of your partners and business relationships. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. We've more or less come to the end of this session. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and a big thank you to our presenters, Anna, Paul, Claire and Robyn. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic session. I'll now hand back to Ms. Nova Peris to continue the day's events.
Thank you very much, Robbie, for hosting and facilitating that very important session. And I also echo Robbie's sentiments on also thanking the presenters, which we had